We're going to jump right into maybe should I CLI? Yeah, we're going to jump into should I CLI? Should I CLI? I'm just going to make a new file. Let's make a new file. Okay, so I realize this TBDEX stuff is, so the TBDEX stuff is likely, TBDEX stuff is likely going to be something that happens when we go, it's going to relate to input origins. And um, basically, when your origin changes, there's going to be a trust boundary, and you might change when you're receiving within an input network, you might change the origin of an input based off of the provenance of the input, which is going to be transferred via source currency, target currency. So currency, target currency, currency that that's currency, conditional offer, currency that you want, target currency, int, currency that you want, currency you currently hold. Ask values exchange on this. Analysis cloud identity have general compile. Data ask processor identity have lookup PFI DIDs. Yeah, DID network. Monitored. So filter PFI. Okay. Ask. Bid matrix plus requirements. Bid matrix plus requirements. Do I have required man? Said which is best. Disclose creds. Yes. Here are the credentials you asked for. Verify credentials. Here's my bid. Accept your bid. Create transaction. Send back transaction details. Inspect contract. Check contract. Sends funds. Verify funds received. Execute contract. Funds sent to house's address. So yeah, so we're establishing trust. Send funds, so that would be apply to create transaction. Check contract. Send funds. For funds received. Execute contracts. Also swallows, also catches. We need to figure this out for when we go across. TDEX likely appropriate um, when we want to so TBDEX likely appropriate when we want a strategic plan be proposed and accepted by, yeah, so basically if we see this input come in, then, so if we see an input come in, so we may see an input come in that says execute this data flow, and that input and the operation implementation or the prioritizer would look at the lineage and say, okay, this thing comes with a new system that takes to be executed. Input added to network. Data flow running operation picks it up. It is dispatched, wrapped by prioritizer, and then the prioritizer checks parent slash provenance information if coming with a TBDEX ask, reply with bid before prioritizing. Do fall. Okay, so basically if you see a system context and so if you see a system context come in and it has a DID which we'll say has a method of TBDEX. TBDEX ask. Currency you currently hold. May you currently hold. Currency you want. Okay. Okay, so currency you currently hold. So the system context that I currently have, the amount of it that I have, 0. The amount that I want, 1. I want this to be executed 1 times. Conditional offer. Source currency. The ID to the system context that we propose to execute in response, which will have appropriate linkage data back to the source currency. Need be. Target currency, the currency the customer wanted. Okay, maybe 1 target amount. 1 willing to offer 1. Okay, so we'll execute 1 thing. Right, okay, so this is the offering DID of the context that we're proposing to be executed, and this is the DID of the context that the agent replies and says, hey, I can execute this. Okay. So, C, and see, and ask is the DID of the context. The same context asking to be executed. Currency in the conditional offer is the DID of the system context, which can be executed by the operation as given with additional provenance within the system context. Show what provenance with attach to the system. I should attach. Okay. Okay. So I think that can let us use that to execute system context. So okay, so now we can do an ask, we can do an answer, so we can wrap that in a prioritizer. And do the request. For accept conditional offer. For accept. Request. Details. So receipt. And that could be another DID doc as well. So this can be implemented in input in data flows applied as overlays to both Alice and Bob's flows within prioritizer and input networks. Okay, so how do we get the other side though? So hey, all right, so one side set an offer. Okay, so it says, hey, I will execute this thing. Okay, it comes back and says, okay, here's an offer, so you can execute this thing. So who's going to respond to that offer? Well, the input network. Well, we should declare the input network should declare what kind of things it might just generate, you know? So for example, if you're going to define an input network and you know your input network is going to be releasing certain events, you know, effectively now you have to capture those events for your system context to be valid. So we could have it so that the input network must declare any inputs that it will just generate at random, and then we have to link those to operations within the parent flow. Input network must have declared up list on instantiation of what inputs it will. Okay, so here's your call response. So basically, what if input network now has one more thing? So then it has to release event for parent data flow. Okay, so input network must have declared list on what inputs will it might add at any time. Okay. Context orchestrator context system context is not valid unless all these declared puts are mapped to operation inputs. Okay. This is declared inputs are mapped to operation inputs. All right, then it's valid. And so one of these inputs might be an input which dynamically adds more definite or more to the declared list. Okay, so it might add more to the declared list, because what if this thing is running and all of a sudden it has a new thing? So then it's new thing. So this new thing input is basically something that must be handled. So you must have an operation that knows how to handle this input network created new thing, because it's been pre-declared and it won't execute if it's not valid. And so it's valid, so it has to consume this somewhere. So there's an operation that consumes something that says, there's an operation that consumes this thing. Therefore, the system context to be valid, the input network to have been used, there must be an operation within the orchestrator context which will deal with this dynamic list modification of the input network to maintain validity checking. Okay. So now what do we need to do? So tomorrow we need to load the CLI, run the overlay data flow, and I'm still struggling with how to create the orchestrator. So pass the system context. The system context for the CLI is okay. System context. So we need to define. Okay, when we run a data flow, we're basically going to assume that when we define a data flow, we assume it executes on the memory orchestrator. And okay, when we define a data flow, they come in from the CLI. We've got a data flow for the overlay. How do we run it? Well, we load it from a file, right? So we load it. If we take it from an we load it from a file, or yeah, so we load it from a file, and then to execute it, we pass it to run. And when we pass it to run, it's gonna run in that executor. So we need to pass so if we pass the data flow, we pass it to run, execute in the memory orchestrator by default. If we need to execute using inputs in another orchestrator, we do it from there. Okay, so it just executes the overlay flow, loads the overlay flow, executes the overlay flow. Then the overlay flow executes the regular CLI flow. The regular CLI flow reads the arguments, executes CV bin tool, because this is just a CV bin tool flow that we'll make. And then the input network, so it'll execute the CV bin tool flow, and it'll set
it'll be a flow that will say if CLI, and it'll say, okay, I'm coming from the top level context has an input here that was passed to the overlay or the overlay stub, and then was passed to this, which is CLI, and that way it knows I'm running from the CLI. So deployment is CLI. The deployment definition, which is linked via input objects instead of definitions now, but to start, we'll just do a definition, is CLI. So CLI, args, and environment get passed to the overlay data flow, which gets executed within the memory orchestrator, which then executes the, so it executes the overlay data flow. The overlay does anything that, is on start, and then accepts as an input the data flow to rep, which is the main data flow, the main CLI data flow in this case. And then the main CLI data flow in this case is this one that we make just for CVBentool. And that one will say, hey, if CLI, and it'll have to accept the CLI because it's pre-declared in the allow list, and the parent one had to use it to call it. It'll say if CLI, then I'm going to instantiate the, then run an operation, and in that operation run, maybe with the, if it's a CLI and it says there's a kube control file in the environment variable, then you run with a Kubernetes, you run an operation. So you do a conditional and you say if kube control file, and if the conditional says you return two values from this operation, which says if kube control file and environment variables, you say if not, then execute with memory orchestrator, and then you call your CVBentool subflow. If yes, then execute with Kubernetes-based orchestrator. Okay, that's what we're going to do tomorrow.